It was a typical Tuesday morning in the small town of Willow Creek. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the quaint, sleepy neighborhood. The quiet hum of early risers filled the air, but in the Matthews household, the day had already begun with an air of discomfort that permeated the walls. Inside the modest home, the kitchen was filled with the aroma of stale coffee and half-eaten cereal. Jasmine, a 10-year-old girl, sat at the kitchen table, her small frame hunched over as she slowly pushed her spoon around in her bowl. Her once vibrant eyes were now dull from months of constant illness, a sickness that had left her drained and exhausted. Her body had become a battleground against an unknown disease, and every day felt like a fight for survival. Her father, David Matthews, stood by the window, staring out at the early morning sky. His face was etched with frustration, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had always been a man of action, used to solving problems with logic and determination. But for the past year, nothing had prepared him for the emotional and physical toll of caring for a sick child. Jasmine's illness had drained him, mentally, emotionally, and financially. "Come on, honey, eat something," David said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. He turned away from the window, his eyes landing on Jasmine's empty bowl. Jasmine looked up at her father, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and guilt. She wasn't hungry, and it was the same story every day. Her body had become an enemy to her, a body that refused to cooperate, no matter how hard she tried to fight it. The constant fatigue, the endless hospital visits, the needles, the medications, it was all too much. But it wasn't just Jasmine who was suffering. Her father, David, was carrying a weight he wasn't sure he could bear much longer. "David, she's not hungry," came the voice of Clara, David's second wife, as she entered the kitchen. Clara had been a part of David's life for the past 5 years, and though she was a loving stepmother to Jasmine, the strain of caring for her sick daughter had begun to take its toll on their marriage. Clara was a strong woman, full of compassion and patience, but even her unwavering support had its limits. The constant struggle, the never-ending cycle of doctor visits and treatments, had worn her down as well. David didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, staring at the table. Clara could see the familiar tension in his shoulders, the silent frustration that had become so evident in recent weeks. The same frustration that he had been hiding from everyone, even her. "We can't keep doing this, Clara," David finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day, it's the same thing. She's getting worse. And I'm running out of options." Clara froze. Her heart sank as she realized where this conversation was headed. She had known that David was struggling, but she hadn't fully grasped just how close he was to the edge. This wasn't the man she had married, the caring, patient father who had been so devoted to his daughter. This was a man who was desperate, worn down, and emotionally drained. But what could she say? What could she do? "David, we've been through this. We've talked about it," Clara said gently, stepping forward to place a hand on his arm. "We need to stay strong for Jasmine. We can't just give up." David shook his head. "I'm not giving up, Clara. I'm trying everything. I've been to every specialist, every doctor. Nothing is working. Her condition is only getting worse, and I can't do this anymore." The words hung in the air like a cloud, heavy and suffocating. Clara could see the pain in his eyes, the guilt that he felt. She could also see something else, a kind of resignation, a quiet surrender to the overwhelming burden that he had been carrying for too long. For the past several months, David had been trying to put on a brave face, pretending to be the strong father, the pillar of the family. But Clara knew better. She had watched him struggle, seen the cracks in his armor. She had tried to support him, to remind him that they were in this together. But the weight of it all had become too much for him to bear alone. "We've tried everything," David repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending that things are going to get better. I can't keep watching her suffer, and I can't keep living like this." Clara's heart broke for him, but she knew she had to stand firm. She couldn't let him give up, not now, not when they were so close to finding a solution. David, she said softly, her voice steady but firm, we can't just give up on her. We owe her more than that. David turned to face her, his expression a mixture of anger and frustration. And what exactly do you want me to do, Clara? I've tried everything. I've worked every angle. I've asked for help. And still, nothing changes. Nothing gets better. Jasmine is getting sicker, and I'm drowning here. The word stung, but Clara didn't flinch. She knew this wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. It was about the toll that this illness had taken on their entire family. The emotional, financial, and physical strain had eroded the foundation of their marriage. But she wasn't ready to give up, not when she could still see a glimmer of hope. We have one more option, David, Clara said quietly, her voice tinged with determination. I've been researching alternative treatments. There's a specialist in the city, Dr. Hayes. He's had success with cases like Jasmine's. I think we should give him a chance. David shook his head, dismissing the idea before it even fully registered. Clara, we've been through this. We don't have the time or the money for another wild goose chase. Jasmine needs more than just experimental treatments. She needs something that actually works. Clara felt a pang of frustration. David was right, in a way. The road ahead was uncertain, and they were running out of time. But the thought of giving up, of sending Jasmine away to some facility where she would be left to suffer alone, was unbearable. We owe it to Jasmine to try, Clara insisted, her voice now more resolute than ever. We can't just throw in the towel. We have to fight for her. I'm not giving up on her. And neither should you. David's face softened slightly, but the skepticism remained. He stared at Clara for a long moment, the weight of his emotions evident in his eyes. Then, without saying another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen. Clara watched him go, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their family was teetering on the edge of something much bigger than just a medical crisis. She glanced over at Jasmine, who had been quietly listening to the exchange from her seat at the table. The girl's face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was a flicker of hope in them. A spark that Clara clung to. I'm going to fight for you, Jasmine, Clara whispered, more to herself than to the girl. I won't let him give up on you. Not now. Not ever. Jasmine looked up at her, offering a faint but hopeful smile. The bond between them, though forged through difficulty, was stronger than anything David could understand in that moment. As Clara left the kitchen to begin making arrangements for the specialist, her thoughts lingered on David's words. She knew that he was struggling, and she didn't blame him. But Clara had made up her mind, this was a fight they couldn't afford to lose. Jasmine was their daughter, and no matter what it took, Clara would do everything in her power to save her. And somewhere deep down, Clara knew that this decision would change everything. The following days felt like a blur of appointments, phone calls, and endless searching for a solution. Clara was determined, more than ever, to find a way to help Jasmine. She had spent hours reading research papers, contacting specialists, and pushing every possible button to get answers. She wasn't about to let the crushing weight of David's resignation hold her back. She was fighting for Jasmine, but she was also fighting for her family. David, on the other hand, was growing increasingly distant. He had agreed to visit Dr. Hayes, though reluctantly. He hadn't given up completely, but it was clear that he was losing hope. The spark that once burned in him, the optimism he had once shown for his daughter's recovery, was now just a faint ember that flickered weakly. One morning, Clara woke up earlier than usual, her mind already racing with the day's tasks. The house was silent, David was still asleep, and Jasmine had spent most of the night in a restless fever. Clara quietly made her way to the living room, where she pulled out the pamphlet she had received from Dr. Hayes's office. The words on the page seemed to dance in her tired eyes, alternative treatment options tailored to each case. Clara felt a sliver of hope, even if the path forward was unclear. She had hoped that David would have been more receptive to this idea. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but the doctor's office was an hour away, and Clara had made the decision to take Jasmine there on her own. David had been overwhelmed for too long, and he needed time to process everything. As Clara prepared the car for the trip, she glanced back at the house, her gaze resting on the living room window. There was something about that moment, the quiet, the stillness, that made her heart ache. She felt like she was standing on the precipice of something monumental, something that would change their lives forever. The drive was uneventful, but Clara felt every minute of it as a weight pressing against her chest. Her mind wandered back to the first day Jasmine had gotten sick, when everything had seemed so normal. She remembered how vibrant and full of life Jasmine had been. She recalled the way she had laughed, the way she had filled their home with her energy. Now, it was like they were living in a constant state of dread, where every phone call, every visit to the doctor's office, felt like another reminder that life would never be the same. As Clara pulled up to Dr. Hayes's office, a small part of her felt that familiar tension in her stomach. She was nervous, but more than anything, she was desperate. This was their last chance. She had told David that she wasn't giving up, and she meant it. If Dr. Hayes could offer a solution, it was the only hope they had left. The office was nothing special, just a modest building on the outskirts of town, tucked between a coffee shop and a dry cleaner. But as Clara walked through the doors, she felt a sense of calm. Maybe it was the welcoming atmosphere of the waiting area, or maybe it was the way the receptionist greeted her with a soft smile, but for the first time in weeks, Clara felt like she was in the right place. Jasmine, as usual, was quiet. Her illness had taken its toll not just on her body but on her spirit. Clara could see the weariness in her eyes, but she also saw the flicker of hope that never seemed to completely disappear. It was the same hope that Clara had, that Dr. Hayes might hold the key to saving her daughter. After a short wait, they were ushered into Dr. Hayes's office. The doctor was a man in his mid-40s, with graying hair and a calm demeanor that immediately put Clara at ease. He looked at Jasmine with a mixture of empathy and professional curiosity. "I've read the reports," Dr. Hayes said after a brief introduction, "and I understand the situation you're facing. Your daughter's case is complex, but I believe there is still a chance for recovery." Clara felt a spark of hope, though she had learned not to let herself get carried away so easily. She needed to hear more than just reassuring words. "Dr. Hayes, what are our options?" Clara asked, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Is there something we haven't tried yet?" Dr. Hayes leaned forward, his eyes focused on Jasmine as he spoke. "What I specialize in is a holistic approach, something that mainstream medicine often overlooks. In your daughter's case, I believe there are underlying factors contributing to her condition, factors that may not have been fully explored." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't expected this approach, but it intrigued her. She'd heard of holistic treatments before but had always dismissed them as alternative remedies with little scientific backing. But this was Dr. Hayes, a man with a reputation for success in cases that other doctors had given up on. If there was any hope left for Jasmine, it was in Dr. Hayes's hands. "We'll start by running a few tests to get a better picture of what might be going on beneath the surface," Dr. Hayes continued. "It's possible that there are toxins in her system, or perhaps there's a nutritional imbalance we need to address. The body is complex, and sometimes the solution is found in the details." Clara listened intently, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had been through so many dead ends, so many doctors who told her that Jasmine's condition was beyond their control. But Dr. Hayes seemed different. He wasn't offering empty promises, he was offering something tangible. The prospect of a detailed, personalized treatment plan gave Clara a new sense of purpose. "We'll need to monitor her progress closely," Dr. Hayes said, "but if we're lucky, this could be the turning point." Clara didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt like they were on the right path. As they left Dr. Hayes's office, Clara's mind raced with possibilities. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but there was hope. And hope was something they hadn't had in a long time. Back at home, the tension between Clara and David had reached a breaking point. David had barely spoken to Clara since the visit to Dr. Hayes's office, and she could tell that he was struggling with the idea of an alternative treatment. He had never been one to embrace unconventional methods, and the thought of taking a new direction after everything they had already been through was difficult for him. Clara knew she couldn't do this alone. She had to bring David back into the fold, remind him why they had been fighting for Jasmine in the first place. The family they had built together, the love they had shared, it was all worth fighting for. But how could she convince David to believe in this new path? How could she make him see what she saw? As she sat alone in their bedroom later that night, Clara's mind wandered back to the moment when David had first said he was ready to give up. The words haunted her. Could she truly keep fighting for Jasmine when David was so ready to walk away? The answer was clear, yes. She would fight, no matter what. But she needed David by her side. She needed him to see that this was the only chance they had left. If they didn't take it, they risked losing everything. Clara knew that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let Jasmine slip away. Not on her watch. And with that, she made a promise to herself, whatever it took, she would fight to the end. Days turned into weeks as Clara's determination began to take shape. She threw herself into the new treatment plan with a relentless focus. Each day felt like a new opportunity, a new chance to get it right. Yet, despite her efforts, the tension in the house was palpable. David, still struggling to cope with his daughter's worsening condition, retreated further into his shell. Every night, they sat at the kitchen table in strained silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like an oppressive fog. Clara had tried to reach him, tried to communicate her feelings, her hopes, her fears, but David seemed lost, absorbed in his own private battle. He no longer looked at Jasmine with the same hopeful eyes. Instead, there was a coldness there, an exhaustion that had seeped deep into his soul. He didn't know how to deal with this, didn't know how to face the reality of the situation. And, Clara feared, he didn't know if he wanted to. One evening, after another failed attempt to connect with him, Clara found herself walking out into the backyard, hoping the cool air would clear her head. The night sky was endless and star-filled, a vast expanse that made her feel small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But in that moment, alone under the stars, Clara found a sense of peace. The calmness of the night reminded her that, no matter how difficult the path ahead seemed, she wasn't alone in her fight. As she turned to head back inside, she saw David sitting by the kitchen table, his head in his hands. His shoulders were slumped, and his body language screamed defeat. Clara hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should approach him or leave him to his thoughts. But something inside her told her it was time to speak up, to make him understand that they could only move forward together. "David," she said softly, stepping into the kitchen. He didn't lift his head at first, but she could see the way his body tensed at the sound of her voice. "We need to talk." David finally looked up, his tired eyes meeting hers. The pain in them was unmistakable. He had never been one to hide his emotions, but this was different. This wasn't the man she had married. The man who once made her laugh, the man who had once been full of hope. This was a man who had been stripped of his optimism, a man who felt like a failure because he couldn't save his daughter. "I can't do this anymore, Clara," he said quietly. His voice cracked with the weight of his words, the finality of them. Clara felt her heart break in that moment, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. "You don't have to do it alone," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotional storm raging inside her. "We're in this together, remember? We promised each other, we promised Jasmine, we would never give up." David let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and hollow. "What's the point, Clara? What's the point of all this when everything we've tried so far hasn't worked? I'm running out of hope." Clara moved closer, kneeling down beside him. She placed her hand gently on his, feeling the coldness of his skin. She knew this wasn't just about Jasmine anymore, it was about their marriage, their family, their entire world crumbling apart at the seams. "David," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion, "I don't have all the answers. But I do know one thing. We can't give up now. If we do, we risk losing everything. I'm not ready to lose you. I'm not ready to lose Jasmine." His eyes softened, but there was still doubt in them. Clara could see that he wasn't fully convinced, that he was still holding on to his own pain, his own uncertainty. But the fact that he was still here, still listening, meant there was hope. There was always hope, even in the darkest moments. Over the next few days, Clara worked tirelessly to implement Dr. Hayes's plan for Jasmine. It wasn't easy, there were setbacks, challenges, and moments where it seemed like nothing would change. But Clara refused to let the frustration of the process defeat her. She kept pushing forward, determined to see this through for Jasmine, for their family. David, despite his doubts, found himself gradually pulled back into the fold. Slowly but surely, he began to take an active role in Jasmine's treatment. They started to work together again, like they had when Jasmine was younger. Clara could see the faintest glimmer of hope in David's eyes as they worked alongside each other. But it was still a fragile hope, one that could easily be extinguished if things didn't improve soon. Then, one evening, after a particularly grueling therapy session, Clara noticed something strange. Jasmine's fever, which had plagued her for days, had finally broken. She wasn't fully recovered, but there was a marked difference in her condition. The dark circles under her eyes had lightened, and her skin, which had been pale and clammy, now had a faint flush of color. For the first time in weeks, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the treatment was working. She called David into the room, her voice trembling with excitement. "David, come look, Jasmine's improving. She's getting better." David walked into the room slowly, his steps cautious as if he didn't want to get his hopes up too high. But when he saw Jasmine, a spark of recognition flashed in his eyes. This was the same child he had nearly given up on. This was the same child who had once been full of life, and now, she was showing signs of that life returning. "Is it really happening?" he asked, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile hope they had built. Clara nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "Yes, I think so. She's starting to turn the corner." David sank into a chair beside Jasmine's bed, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her forehead. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of peace between them. Clara knew they weren't out of the woods yet, but this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. It was the first sign of progress they had seen in months. But just as Clara allowed herself to relax for the first time in what felt like forever, a phone call interrupted the moment. Clara glanced at the caller ID, it was Dr. Hayes's office. Her stomach sank. She had no idea what this call would bring, but she knew it wasn't going to be a simple check-in. She picked up the phone, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hello? Mrs. Turner?" Dr. Hayes's voice was calm but serious. "We need to talk about Jasmine. There's something we found in her test results that I think you need to know." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. "What is it? Is it bad?" "I'm afraid it's more complicated than we originally thought. We need to get Jasmine in here for further testing. There's something in her blood work that could change everything." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Was this a setback? Was it more than she could handle? David, sensing the tension in the air, turned to her, his expression filled with worry. Clara didn't know how to answer. She didn't know if they were about to face yet another blow, or if they were closer to the end of this harrowing journey. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain, they weren't giving up now. Not when they had come this far. Not when Jasmine was showing signs of improvement. As Clara hung up the phone, she turned to David, her voice a whisper. "We've got more work to do. But we can handle this. Together." David nodded, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were united in their fight. The days that followed the call from Dr. Hayes were a whirlwind of tests, scans, and hospital visits. Every moment felt stretched thin, as if they were teetering on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether they would fall or find solid ground. Clara could barely remember the last time she'd gotten a full night's sleep. There was always something else to do, another form to fill out, another doctor to speak with. Jasmine's condition fluctuated from day to day, and every time Clara felt a glimmer of hope, it was met with uncertainty. David, meanwhile, had retreated further into himself. The weight of the situation had only grown heavier on his shoulders, and while he remained present in Jasmine's care, his emotional distance was undeniable. Clara noticed the way he seemed to stare off into the distance, lost in thoughts that were impossible to reach. It was as though he was holding back from fully embracing the fight for his daughter, as if fear had gripped him too tightly. Fear that they were wasting time, that they were fighting a losing battle, or worse, that the inevitable end was already written in the stars. It was a fear Clara shared in quiet moments when the world seemed still, but she refused to let it consume her. She had made a promise to Jasmine, and she intended to keep it. No matter how uncertain the path was, Clara would walk it beside her daughter, step by step. After several days of medical appointments, they finally received a definitive answer from Dr. Hayes. Clara and David were sitting in the sterile, cold office, their hands clasped tightly together, both knowing that this was the moment they had been dreading, the moment that would reveal the true extent of Jasmine's illness. Dr. Hayes, ever the professional, sat across from them, his face serious but not devoid of empathy. Clara had come to respect the man's unwavering dedication, even when the news he delivered was difficult to swallow. "I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than we initially thought," Dr. Hayes began, his voice measured but heavy. "The blood work and scans we've reviewed indicate that Jasmine's condition is rare, an autoimmune disorder that has been affecting her organs in ways we didn't predict." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had always known that Jasmine's illness was mysterious, but hearing it confirmed by a medical professional brought the stark reality crashing down on her. The word rare echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. "We've seen cases like this before," Dr. Hayes continued, "but they are few and far between. It's going to require an aggressive treatment approach, one that involves a combination of immunosuppressants and ongoing therapies. It's not a guaranteed solution, but it's the best option we have." Clara swallowed hard, trying to process the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a matter of fighting a disease, it was a battle for Jasmine's future. And even though Clara had never backed down from a challenge before, this felt different. It felt like a war she wasn't fully prepared to win. David was silent beside her, his face pale as he absorbed the words. His mind was 1,000 miles away, and Clara could see the struggle within him, the battle between his desire to hope and the overwhelming fear that was suffocating him. She squeezed his hand, silently urging him to focus, to stay present. They needed each other more than ever. Dr. Hayes gave them a moment of silence before speaking again. "I want to be clear, though. This treatment will be difficult. It will come with its own set of challenges, including side effects that could make Jasmine feel worse before she gets better. I understand that this is a lot to take in, but I need you both to be prepared." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Clara had always known that Jasmine's road to recovery would be anything but easy, but hearing the doctor outline the grueling nature of the treatment made the future seem even more uncertain. "We can do it," Clara said, her voice unwavering. She wasn't sure if she believed the words herself, but she had to believe them. Jasmine needed to see hope in her mother's eyes. She needed to believe that her parents were in this together, no matter how hard the road ahead might be. "We have to do it." David nodded, though his expression was still clouded with doubt. His mind was still trying to catch up with the reality of the situation, but Clara could see that, deep down, he was beginning to accept the necessity of this fight. It wasn't about the odds anymore. It wasn't about the uncertainty of Jasmine's condition. It was about taking action, about moving forward with the knowledge that they could make a difference in her life, no matter how small. The following days were a blur of medical procedures, hospital rooms, and new treatments. Jasmine's strength was tested in ways Clara could never have imagined. There were days when her daughter's body seemed to reject the treatment, causing feverish tremors and violent rashes that covered her delicate skin. Clara would sit by her side for hours, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, but there were moments when she feared that they were losing her. David's presence became more and more intermittent, his emotional burden too heavy for him to bear all at once. Clara knew he was struggling, but there was nothing she could do to pull him from his despair. She had tried, many times, to talk to him, to urge him to open up, but each time, he recoiled further. It was as though he had built a wall around himself, a wall that Clara could not breach. She hated seeing him like this. He was the man she had married, the man she had once believed was unshakable in his faith and determination. But now, he was lost in the shadows of his own mind, and Clara didn't know how to bring him back. And then, just when Clara was on the brink of exhaustion, something happened that would change everything. It was a late evening, and Clara was sitting in the small hospital room, watching Jasmine sleep, when David finally came in. He hadn't been there all day, and Clara's heart sank as she realized that he had once again distanced himself from their daughter's struggle. But then, as he stood in the doorway, something in his expression caught Clara off guard. There was a look in his eyes, something fierce, something determined, that she hadn't seen in a long time. "I've been thinking," David said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "We can't just sit here and wait for answers. I'm going to take action. I'm going to make sure Jasmine gets the best care, no matter what it takes." Clara blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. This was the first time in weeks that David had spoken with such certainty. She stood up from the chair, walking over to him slowly. "David, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm not going to let her go without a fight. I've been waiting for a miracle, hoping for something to change on its own, but that's not going to happen. I need to be the one to fight for her. I need to be the one to take control of this situation." Clara felt a rush of emotion, relief, gratitude, and love. This was the man she had married. This was the father Jasmine needed. It was as though a light had been turned on in David's heart, and suddenly, he was the father she had always known he could be. Clara reached out and hugged him tightly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "David, I'm so glad you're back." David held her close, his voice steady as he whispered, "I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." The next few days brought a renewed sense of purpose. David was more present, more determined to help Jasmine fight, and Clara found herself once again drawing strength from him. Together, they dove into Jasmine's treatment with renewed energy, seeking out specialists, exploring every possible avenue for healing. It wasn't easy, and there were still setbacks, but for the first time in weeks, they had hope. They had the strength to fight for their daughter, together. And with that hope, they began to rebuild the bond that had once seemed so fragile. But Clara knew, deep in her heart, that the hardest battles were still to come. And no matter what, she was ready to face them, because for Jasmine, for their family, there was no other choice. As the weeks passed, Clara felt herself being pulled in every direction. Each day seemed to bring more complications and obstacles, and yet, she never wavered in her commitment to Jasmine's recovery. It wasn't just the treatments, the constant doctor's appointments, or the fear that sometimes gripped her chest. It was the responsibility of being the pillar for her daughter, of holding everything together while trying to navigate a future that was uncertain at best. Every time she looked at Jasmine, she was reminded of the strength her daughter had shown, and that kept her going, no matter how tired she was. David had finally come to terms with the gravity of the situation. His earlier emotional withdrawal had slowly turned into a determination that Clara hadn't seen in him for years. He was there every step of the way now, not just physically but emotionally as well. He researched every possible treatment option, from alternative therapies to experimental trials, anything that might give Jasmine a better shot at life. Clara had never felt more grateful for his presence, even as their lives grew increasingly chaotic. The house was never quiet anymore, and even their time at the hospital became an exhausting routine of tests, blood draws, and hopeful conversations with specialists. Through it all, Jasmine remained a beacon of light, her resilience and courage inspiring Clara every single day. There were moments when Clara would look at her daughter, as she lay in the hospital bed with the IVs hooked up to her frail body, and she would think, how does she do it? Jasmine's condition would worsen at times, and Clara could see the pain in her eyes, but she never complained. She was quiet in her suffering, choosing to endure rather than voice her discomfort. Clara admired her, but it also broke her heart to see Jasmine suffer so. Then came the day when everything changed. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Clara received a call from Dr. Hayes that would alter the course of their lives. Her hands trembled as she answered the phone, sensing immediately that this wasn't going to be just another check-in. "Mrs. Landon, I need you to come in as soon as possible. There's something urgent we need to discuss about Jasmine's condition," Dr. Hayes said, his tone clipped, yet laced with urgency. Clara's heart sank. She looked across the room at David, who had just come in from work. His tired eyes met hers, and he instantly understood something was wrong. Without hesitation, they both left for the hospital, Clara's mind racing as she replayed the doctor's words over and over. What could it be? Had Jasmine's condition taken another turn for the worse? Was there a complication that they hadn't anticipated? The uncertainty gnawed at Clara's insides, her nerves starting to unravel. When they arrived at the hospital, Dr. Hayes was waiting for them in his office, looking more somber than ever before. Clara tried to read his expression, but it was difficult to tell what was going through his mind. He gestured for them to sit, and Clara could barely breathe as she settled into the chair. David's hand was steady in hers, though she could feel the tension between them. "I'm afraid the news isn't what we were hoping for," Dr. Hayes began, his voice grave. "We've been reviewing Jasmine's latest scans and lab results, and unfortunately, the disease is progressing faster than we anticipated. The autoimmune disorder is now affecting more of her organs, and her kidneys are beginning to show signs of failure. We've done everything we can, but it seems we've reached a point where we have to consider more aggressive options." Clara's blood ran cold as she processed the words. Kidneys failing. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Jasmine had been strong, resilient, how could this happen? Her mind screamed for an answer, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, constricted, as though there was no room left to breathe. David's hand tightened around hers, but Clara could feel him beginning to slip again. His earlier resolve seemed to falter, and she could see the panic in his eyes. "What do you mean more aggressive options?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "What do we do now?" Dr. Hayes took a deep breath, then looked them both in the eyes. "We're looking at the possibility of a kidney transplant. It's risky, especially with Jasmine's immune system compromised, but it may be her best chance. We need to find a donor, and we need to act quickly before the situation becomes even more critical." Clara could barely hear the words. They felt muffled, like they were coming from a distance. A transplant? It was the first time anyone had mentioned this option, and it felt surreal. There was so much to consider, so many unknowns, and Clara couldn't even fathom what it would mean for Jasmine, her daughter, who had already been through so much. Clara closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, trying to ground herself in the reality that was quickly slipping from her grasp. "We'll do it," David said, his voice unwavering now. Clara turned to look at him, shocked by the force in his words. His face was set, determined. This was the man she had married, the man who had finally found his way back to them, his family, his fight for their daughter's life. "We'll do whatever it takes to get Jasmine the transplant she needs," David continued, his voice stronger now, filled with a quiet confidence that Clara hadn't expected. "We can find a donor. We'll get this done." Clara nodded, tears welling up in her eyes as she realized that this was the first time in months she had seen David truly, completely committed to their daughter's survival. For so long, he had seemed lost, uncertain, as though he was waiting for something to change without taking action himself. But now, in this moment, he was taking charge. He was going to do whatever it took to save Jasmine. And for the first time, Clara believed it. They spent the next few days in a blur of hospital visits, testing, and searching for a donor. It was a race against time, and Clara's heart ached as she watched Jasmine grow weaker with each passing day. But something had shifted in Clara, too. With David's renewed strength and determination, Clara found herself drawing strength from him, from the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time they could win. Together, they could get Jasmine through this. The transplant process wasn't easy. They faced complications every step of the way, from finding a suitable donor to ensuring Jasmine's immune system could handle the transplant. The road was long, and Clara had to summon every ounce of courage she had to stay strong. But she did it. She stayed with Jasmine through every moment, comforting her during sleepless nights, holding her hand through the pain, and encouraging her with every ounce of love she had. The surgery was a success, but it wasn't without its challenges. Jasmine's body fought to accept the new kidney, and the road to recovery was slow and painful. There were moments when Clara feared they had made the wrong decision, when the road ahead seemed too daunting to continue. But they did. They pushed through. As the weeks went on, Jasmine slowly began to improve. It was a long, gradual process, but every small victory felt like a triumph. There were still dark days, days when Jasmine's body seemed to rebel against the healing process, but with each passing day, Clara could see the light returning to her daughter's eyes. One afternoon, as Jasmine sat up in her bed, smiling weakly at her parents, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't over. The battle wasn't won yet, but they had fought, and they were still fighting. Jasmine was still with them, still holding on. And that was enough for now. Looking at David, Clara smiled. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're doing it." David nodded, his eyes filled with pride and love. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "But we will be. Together." Clara knew, in that moment, that no matter what happened next, they would continue to fight. Together. For Jasmine. For each other. For their family. Weeks turned into months, and as Jasmine's recovery continued to unfold, Clara and David found themselves in a place they never imagined they would be. It was a place of guarded optimism, where every new day brought a new challenge, but also a new possibility. Jasmine had endured so much already, her strength and resilience had surpassed every expectation. Yet there were moments when Clara's heart would race at the thought that it might not be enough. But with each passing day, as Jasmine's condition stabilized, Clara's hope began to solidify into something tangible. It was still a long road, but they were walking it together. The road to recovery, however, wasn't just a physical journey, it was emotional, too. Jasmine had changed in ways that Clara hadn't anticipated. The girl who had been so full of life, who once danced around the living room and painted in vibrant colors, now had a quiet, introspective nature. The battles she had fought, against her own body, against a disease that threatened to take everything from her, had left their mark. Jasmine's eyes, though still filled with the spark of hope, sometimes seemed far away, like she was searching for something she had lost. Clara watched it happen slowly, this shift in her daughter's demeanor, and though she feared it, she also understood it. No one could go through something like this without changing. David, too, was different now. The emotional detachment he once wore like armor had faded, replaced with a rawness Clara hadn't seen in years. He wasn't just a man committed to the idea of his daughter's survival anymore, he was a man who was living it, every single day. It wasn't always easy for Clara to adjust to this new version of him. His fears, his doubts, his frustrations, they were all laid bare in a way that was both comforting and overwhelming. Clara had once borne the brunt of his emotional absence, had carried the weight of their family's struggles on her own shoulders, but now she shared that weight with him. One afternoon, after yet another round of doctor visits, Clara sat alone in the hospital waiting room. David had gone to check on Jasmine, who had been having a particularly rough day. The sterile smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixing with the hum of fluorescent lights. Clara stared at the floor, her fingers gripping her purse as her mind raced. The situation wasn't over. In fact, it was far from over. Yes, Jasmine had made it through the transplant, but every day was a new test of her strength, a new battle with her own body's limitations. The future still seemed uncertain, and it terrified Clara. What if something happened? What if the transplant didn't work? What if they didn't have enough time? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and for a brief moment, Clara felt completely lost in the weight of it all. Just as Clara's thoughts began to spiral, a voice interrupted her. "Mrs. Landon." It was Dr. Hayes, his face a mix of concern and professionalism. He gestured for her to follow him. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood up, anxiety welling up in her chest. Was something wrong with Jasmine? Had there been a complication? Clara followed Dr. Hayes down the corridor, her mind racing. He led her into a small consultation room, closing the door behind them. As he sat across from her, Clara barely heard the words he spoke. His lips moved, but the sound of her heartbeat filled her ears. "Mrs. Landon, I want to talk to you about Jasmine's progress," Dr. Hayes began, his voice steady and calm. "The good news is that her body is accepting the transplant better than we initially expected. Her kidney function is stabilizing, and there's a significant improvement in her overall health. But I want to be honest with you, there's still a long road ahead." Clara nodded, her breath a little steadier now that she had heard some positive news. But Dr. Hayes wasn't done. "We're also seeing some unexpected results from the treatments we've been using. It's not entirely understood, but there's something about Jasmine's immune response that we haven't seen in many cases before. It's like her body is adapting in ways we couldn't have predicted." He paused, clearly weighing his next words. "This could be a breakthrough, but it also means we need to stay vigilant. We don't know what the long-term effects will be." Clara listened, her eyes fixed on Dr. Hayes as he spoke. The hope was there, shining through like a beacon, but there was also a warning that kept Clara grounded. Jasmine wasn't out of the woods yet, and this unexpected turn could go either way. But Clara wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. In the days that followed, Clara found herself becoming more determined than ever. If Jasmine was fighting this hard, if she was going to face the unknown with such strength, then Clara would do the same. The days of doubting, of wondering what if, were over. Clara was going to fight alongside her daughter, no matter what it took. She leaned on David, and together, they made decisions about Jasmine's care, always thinking ahead, always staying focused on what needed to be done. As the months wore on, Jasmine's condition fluctuated. There were setbacks, days when Clara felt like they were right back at square one, but there were also victories. Small victories that felt monumental. Jasmine was eating more, speaking with more clarity, and even asking to go outside for walks. Clara watched with a cautious optimism, not wanting to get her hopes too high but also not wanting to deny herself the joy of those moments. It was all part of the process. One evening, as Clara sat beside Jasmine's bed, she watched her daughter's breathing slow, steady, as she drifted into a peaceful sleep. It was moments like this, moments of quiet normalcy, that reminded Clara how far they had come. Jasmine was still fighting, but she was also living. And as much as Clara had feared this journey, she couldn't help but be grateful for every day she got to spend with her daughter. The community had rallied around them too, showing support in ways that Clara hadn't expected. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers had reached out, offering words of encouragement, making meals, and organizing fundraisers to help with Jasmine's medical bills. Clara never imagined the power of community in a time like this, but it had been nothing short of a miracle. It reminded her that, no matter how isolated she felt in those dark hours of doubt, she was never truly alone. But despite the support and the progress, Clara still felt the weight of the uncertainty. She still had nightmares of waking up to find Jasmine gone, still had moments when she couldn't breathe because the thought of losing her daughter was too much to bear. No mother should ever have to face what she had faced. But Clara was no longer the same woman she had been when this all started. She had changed. She was stronger, more resilient, more determined. And she knew, deep down, that no matter what the future held, she would never stop fighting for her daughter. As the days went by, Clara looked at David, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw him as the man she had married, the man who was as committed to their family as she was. They had been through hell together, and they had come out the other side. No matter what happened next, Clara knew they could face it, side by side. And, more importantly, she knew that no matter what, Jasmine would never be alone in this fight. Not as long as Clara and David were breathing. One afternoon, as Jasmine sat up on her own for the first time in weeks, Clara held her hand, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't over. But they had made it this far, and with each passing day, they were moving closer to the life they had once imagined for themselves. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about living. And Clara was determined to make sure that Jasmine lived to see many more days of sunshine, laughter, and love. After all, they had already survived the impossible. And that meant nothing was truly out of their reach.